Hey guys, it's Justin with Shock Therapy, and we're going to go through the instructions on how to install a dual rate spring kit on a Can-Am Maverick XRS. This spring kit is going to accomplish at least two things for you. One, it's going to create a much more plush ride, especially through the small chop and chatter and mid-stroke of the shock. It will also add more bump stage and G-out resistance for the jump landings, washouts, and other compressed situations. This is a relatively easy installation, so let's go over to the bench and take a look at what's included in the kit. So as you see, we've laid out a complete dual rate spring kit on the bench to my left. Included in the kit are going to be 8 coil springs. Each of these coil springs are specific rates for your car according to the accessories and driving style that you've given us when you ordered the kit. Make sure that you pay attention to the top of the springs that are marked as to front upper, front lower, and rear springs as well, so that the correct spring ends up in the correct spot. Also included in the kit are 2 crossover ring sets for the front shocks. The reason that we don't include crossovers for the rear shocks is because this car comes factory with rear crossovers from Fox on the rear shock. We do have an option. If you would like all the crossovers to match, you can purchase another set of crossovers for the rear shocks. As always, we recommend that you lay out all the parts that are included in the kit in advance. That way you can make sure that you have all the parts that are needed and you can install these parts in the correct order. Some of the tools that you're going to need for this kit are various wrenches in the 16mm, 18mm size, as well as 16 and 18mm sockets. Also, multiple ratchets, standard screwdriver and hammer, tape measure of course. Electric tools will also make your life easier. You will also need a very good spring compressor and a Pro Eagle jack. So let's go ahead and get this installation started. First, jack the front of the car up to where the tires are just barely off the ground. Next, remove the shocks from the car, starting with the lower hardware. Using your toes underneath the tire, lift the tire slightly while you remove the lower hardware to make things easy. Next, remove the top hardware from the shock and remove the shock from the car. You do not have to keep track of the left or right side. They are interchangeable. Next, install the shock in the spring compressor. Grab the standard screwdriver and lower the factory bump stop on the shaft by 2 to 3 inches. Compress the spring system and remove the lower spring perch. Release the springs and remove both upper and lower spring and factory divider. Now, with the screwdriver and hammer, unlock the factory preload rings. They're just threaded together. Remove the shock and place on the bench to get ready to install the crossover rings and set your preload heights. Repeat these steps on the other shock. With the shock on the bench, it's time to set the preload collars to the correct height. Measure from the bottom of the black bridge down to the bottom of the preload collars at the plastic isolator. This measurement should be 1.25 inches. With the preload collars set, grab your crossover rings for this shock and install those. The crossover rings have a flat surface. Those should be touching each other as you install the rings. The recessed groove in the crossover is set up for the O-ring, which should be facing the bottom of the shock or the top of the shock as you thread it on. Now that you have the crossover rings threaded onto the shock body, the measurement for the crossover is 4.5 inches down from the bridge to the bottom of the crossover rings. Once you've located 4.5 inches, go ahead and install the orange O-ring. Once the crossover ring measurement is set, go ahead and install the shock in the spring compressor. Repeat the same steps on the other shock. Install the shock in the spring compressor. Install the front upper spring, making sure that you look at the notes on top of the spring, confirming that it's the correct one. Install the factory spring divider with the long end facing the shock shaft. Install the lower front spring, confirming that it's written as the lower front spring. Make sure that both springs touch the plastic divider with the ends of the springs on opposite sides of the plastic divider. This makes sure that the plastic divider is as straight as possible and limits the amount of spring bowing as it compresses. Compress the spring package until you have enough room to install the lower spring perch. Install the lower spring perch and loosen the spring package slowly until the spring perch and the lower eyelet line up. Remove the shock and get ready to install on the front of the car. Repeat the process on the other shock. Now install the front shocks back on the car, starting with the upper hardware. With the upper hardware installed, install the lower hardware using your toes to lift the tire slightly. It makes it easier to install the bolt. You can also leave all the hardware loose. With the shocks installed and the hardware left loose, go ahead and lower the car back on the ground. With the front of the car back on the ground, you can go to the rear and jack it up until the tires are barely off the ground. With the tires off the ground, go ahead and remove the rear shocks. Start with the lower hardware. With the lower hardware loose, use your toes to lift the tire slightly, shaking the system until the bolt comes out easy. Once the lower hardware is removed, go ahead and loosen the upper hardware and remove the shocks. Now install the rear shock in the spring compressor and lower the bump stop 2 inches on the shock shaft to make room to remove the lower spring perch. Compress the spring system until the lower spring perch can be removed with the rock guard. Remove the factory spring package, keeping the factory spring divider for use later. Use a screwdriver and hammer to loosen the preload collars. Also loosen the factory crossover rings. Repeat the steps on the other shock. With a shock on the bench, take the tape measure and double check your new measurements for the crossover ring and also the preload collars. The preload collar should be 3 inches down from the bridge of the shock to the bottom of the preload collar. The crossover ring should be 8 inches down to the bottom of the crossover ring. With the measurements checked, take the shock and install it in the spring compressor next. Repeat the same steps on the other shock. Next, install the upper rear spring. Double check that the notes on top of the spring tell you it's the upper rear. Next, install the spring divider with the long end of the spring divider facing the shaft. Install the lower rear spring, making sure that the ends of the spring line up on the spring divider on the opposite side of the upper spring end. Compress the spring package until you have enough room to install the lower spring perch with the rock guard on it. Release the system until the rock guard spring perch line up with the lower loop of the shock. Now remove the shock and get ready to install it on the back of the car. Repeat the same steps on the other shock. Now install the rear shocks back on the car, starting with the upper hardware. With the upper hardware left loose, now install the lower hardware using your toes to lift the tires slightly. This helps to install the hardware. Remember, you can leave it loose. With the shocks installed on the car and the hardware left loose, go ahead and lower the car back on the ground. With the car back on the ground, go ahead and hop in it and start it up, move it around. If you can drive it around the block and come to a stop slowly, that would be the best. If you don't have the room, then move it back and forth using the brakes and throttle as much as you can to settle the suspension. Once you're done with that, come to a stop without using the brakes so we can check the ride heights. With the driver remaining in the car, check the ride heights. The front ride height is measured from the ground to the bottom of the frame, just behind the lower control arm mount tabs, right at the firewall area. With stock tires, the front of the car should be about 13.5 inches off the ground. With the front checked, proceed to the rear and measure the ride height in the back of the car. This measurement should be taken from the ground up to the bottom of the frame between the control arm mounts. With stock tires, the rear measurement should be about 13 inches. Once the ride height is accurate, proceed to measure the crossover ring height above the plastic spring divider. In the rear, the gap between the crossover ring and the black plastic divider should be about 2 to 2.5 inches. With the back checked, go to the front and see what the front crossover ring height is. All of these measurements are done with the driver remaining in the car. The front crossover ring gap between the crossover and the black plastic divider should be between 1 and 1.5 inches in the front. If the crossover rings need to be adjusted, since they're threaded on, merely thread them down or up as you need to gain the measurement that we're asking for. Once the crossover ring is located accurately, lock them together with the screwdriver and hammer. Since your ride height is also set accurately, this is the time to lock down the preload collars as well. Repeat this lockdown process for the crossover ring and preload collars on all 4 shocks. With everything set accurately according to our measurements, it's time to tighten all the hardware for the shocks. So now that you've tightened all the hardware on the car, you're basically done with the complete installation. But there are things that you should check with this system once you've driven the car. The springs are brand new. They're made in the USA and warranted for life. But since they are brand new, they will take a set over the first 100 to 300 miles. That means that after 200 to 300 miles of driving, you want to check your ride heights again. We would expect them to settle between 1/2 inch and maybe as much as 1 inch, depending on how many accessories you put on the car. But it's up to you to check these ride heights over time, adjust them back to the ride height that we request, and you should be good for the lifetime of the spring kit. Another reason why you want to check ride heights on a routine basis is that people add accessories to their car all the time. They never remember that they do. It's very easy to add 100 to 200 pounds to the car and not even realize it, and all of a sudden the car sits a little bit low and can tend to bottom out a lot easier. So just keep in mind checking ride heights from trip to trip. If the car sits a little bit lower, raise it up. That way you bring the ride quality back, and It'll be perfect for the life of the spring kit. The adjustment process in the spring kit to make it ride the best it possibly can is in the clicker mechanism for the shock. The shocks on this car have a high and low speed compression adjuster. When you drive the car, if you tend to bottom the car out, as in drag the skid plate through a big transition, the high speed compression adjustment is the one you want to adjust. All the way counterclockwise or loose is the softest ride quality that the shock will give you. If you bottom the car out at that point, you want to add 2 to 3 clicks at a time in high-speed compression to cure the bottoming in the system. The low-speed compression adjuster controls the small chop and chatter. So if you leave that all the way loose, the chop and chatter is the smoothest as possibly can be. If you turn that up a few clicks at a time, it'll settle the car. If you turn it up too much, you'll start to feel the chop and chatter. You want to back that off to where you used to be. If you've adjusted all the compression adjustments on the shock and you find that with them turned all the way up, you can still bottom the car out, there are 2 things you can do. Double check your ride height. Make sure that you're as high as the system needs to be according to our numbers. Second, you can lower the crossover ring 1/4 of an inch at a time. As you lower the crossover ring, it will engage the heavier lower spring sooner, which will help you with bottoming out. You don't want to lower the crossover ring any more than you have to. If you've lowered it too far, you'll find that the car will land from a jump or a G-out and tend to buck right back out of it. If this happens, raise the crossover ring back to where you used to be and adjust the compression adjusters as needed. With the suspension adjusted properly, you'll notice that our spring kit will give you a much more plush ride quality through the chop, chatter, and small whoops. It will stop rear bucking and let the car fly level off jumps. You will also notice that the car will have much more bottom out resistance for the big hits and jump landings than it used to. It should resist bottoming much easier, while at the same time being more plush. If you love the improvement that the spring kit gives you, we offer even more for your car. Our internal shock modifications, or ride improvement system, doubles the improvement that the spring kit gives you on your car. It's the perfect marriage between shock modification and spring kit, giving you the most ride quality you could possibly get out of your Maverick. Also, our internal shock modifications are designed to work with this spring kit, so you will not have to buy any other components in order to upgrade the shocks. If you have any more questions or comments on this spring installation, feel free to call the shop anytime or leave a comment below. And for more great UTV content, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Shock Therapy LLC. Are those shock sides specific on the back, or are they the same either way?
I think they're the same.
Chase?
What?
You know that?
No.
That's what I thought. Check, check, check. Hello, testicles. Let's see how many things we can do in one day and make sure we get all done with all of them. Okay, then walk out that way.
Snoop